It's kind of an unusual story because as an American, if you talk to most Americans, certainly of my age,
Yeah.
most people just fell into this industry, the business, that I didn't ever really want to be a licensed customs hospital, because a licensed
Yeah.
customs broker, you're very much in a box, and that box is government regulation. It's
Yeah.
import law. It's all of those things. With that at DHL, that was with something called a Flexitank. And a Flexitank is this really cool bladder. It's anywhere from 16,000 to 24,000 liters, and it goes into a 20-foot container, 20-foot ocean container. And India was it could have been harder, but I had the vice president of ocean freight for India was great. And we had met here in the US when he was in country, and he's like, there's a huge opportunity here and I want to do this. And so when I was in India for about 10 days, he traveled with me everywhere. Certainly AI is important. AI is here to stay.
Yeah.
I still, on the back of my head, as a firm Gen Xer, I still worry about
Well, welcome everyone to the Vserve Ebusiness podcast on supply chain management, where we invite industry experts from all walks of life to share their experiences and also gather helpful tips along the way for us. So today we are moving past your standard, rate sheets. We're looking at the absolute gridlock of global trade, what it takes to inject, tactical discipline, kind of like boardroom level discipline back into the international logistics. And our guest today is a global executive in international freight, forwarding with more than 30 years of enterprise level leadership. He has operated, absolute intersection of strategy, execution. He has served as the chief commercial officer and president across complex multi-regional networks. Notably, there was one global product founder and owner of DHL's ocean freight bulk liquid practice. Like, that's amazing. And he has single-handedly established functional infrastructure across 5 continents and dozens of strict, regulatory environments. And I'm so excited to have you today here.
great. Thank you. Good morning to you.
Thank you. Good morning as well. I'm so excited. I didn't know like what to add and what not to add, so I added everything I could. But I will obviously, my first question be, tell us, how did you end up in supply chain? How did you know this was, the field that you wanted to do, and how did you kind of navigate it through the 30 years that you've been in this field?
Sure. It's kind of an unusual story because as an American, if you talk to most Americans, certainly of my age,
Yeah.
most people just fell into this industry. No, you had no
Yep.
idea, what a freight forwarder is or does. And I would say that even, heading into college, I was in the same place. And, my thought was I went to the Citadel, which is a military college in South Carolina, with the idea of
Mhm.
commissioning in the Marine Corps when I finished.
Oh, wow.
Along the way, I realized that probably wasn't really what I wanted to do, because I had met someone, and we wanted to get married. And if the Marines want you to have a wife, they'll issue you a wife. So
Yeah.
so I had to kind of figure out, okay, what do I really want to do? And back in those days, I remember driving over the bridges there in Charleston, over the harbor, and I would see these ships coming in and out with all these containers on them, and wondering, what's that all about? I had what
Uh-huh.
in my thought, why are there trucks on a ship? That doesn't make any sense to me. How does that work? And lo and behold, I guess it was when I was maybe a sophomore. My mom took a job with one of the steamship lines. They were in Charlotte, so 3 hours inland, but they had an office there. And my mom, just answered a blind ad and went to work for one of the steamship lines. And that
Uh-huh.
really gave me access into the international shipping industry. And I don't know, my professors may have gotten tired of it, because it seemed like every time I had to write some kind of a thesis paper or do a project or something like that,
Yeah.
I did that
Yeah.
on the my specific target at the time was really more the ocean freight. And so I really, I targeted ocean freight and ocean shipping and all of my interest around the ocean shipping. And then when I graduated, I found out about freight forwarding along the way. And then,
Mhm.
when I graduated in 1988, the economy was a little harsh. There weren't a lot of jobs. I ended up being a food and wine buyer for about a year and a half, and then I made my way into the international freight forwarding business, and I've been there ever since. And it's been a great adventure, my career, for sure.
Wow. Wow. So when we talk about I guess international freight, tell us a little bit more on that. What do you actually do? What's your kind of like job responsibilities? What you started off as, obviously, but
Sure,
how did it grow on you? Because
sure.
I've not met a lot of these people who do international freight, so I would love
Yeah,
to hear more on that.
yeah. It's kind of interesting, and I remember my first job. I spent about 6 weeks in operations, doing customs clearance and doing the basically learning the mechanics of really more ocean. Well, really ocean
Mhm.
and air at the time, but on the import side, which the U.S. is a net importer, so that makes sense.
Mhm.
But as I tried to explain to my friends what did I do, what was it that I did,
Yeah.
and then
Mhm.
especially when 6 weeks after sitting at an operations desk, I was given a car and an expense account and told to go sell.
Yeah.
And look, that was a great experience. I learned so much. But what I came down to, how I like to explain what it is I do, is I'm kind of a travel agent for freight.
Yeah.
So you have 1,000 desks that are sitting in Vietnam, and you want those desks to be in Chicago. Well, how do you do
Mhm.
that? Well, I do that, and I can make those arrangements from the factory door in Vietnam all the way to the door in Chicago. Or
Mhm.
you have an urgent, and I had to do this a lot back in the day. You've got a manufacturing line down. I used to do a lot in the textile industry when that was a thing in the Carolinas. And okay, we've got a machine down. There's a line down. We need a very special part. That part is setting uh, you know, uh, in a factory somewhere outside of Milan, and it needs to be here
Mhm.
yesterday. And I was the
Wow.
guy that would then make arrangements to get that part, get it to Milan, get it on a flight, and get it to where it needed to be here in the United States. And I focused really on the Southeast United States at the time. Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia were really the areas that I operated.
Wow. Wow. That sounds amazing. And there's so many questions that I have that I've written down. Like, your um compliance. How does that
Sure,
work? How
sure.
does restoring the operational discipline works? But we'll start with compliance. I don't want to get ahead
Sure.
of myself. Like how do you view that when you're doing like, your administrative tasks and stuff like that?
Sure. So compliance, how do I say this? Well, let me back up a little bit. I remember saying when I entered the business that I didn't ever really want to be a licensed customs house broker, because a licensed
Yeah.
customs broker, you're very much in a box, and that box is government regulation. It's
Yeah.
import law. It's all of those things, and you have to do that in a very specific manner. And I tend toward being a big picture strategy guy,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah.
being a customs broker is more of that transactional, tactical kind of, very desk level kind of a thing, generally speaking. um, but then 4 years into my career, I realized as I headed into management that not having a broker's license was limiting to me, because
Mhm.
then I always had to have a broker that worked for me, which I still did,
Yeah.
but they knew more than I did, and so that didn't feel good,
Yeah.
right? I didn't,
Yeah.
I wanted to know what they knew, right? So I went and I
Mhm.
got a broker's license. To become a licensed broker in the United States, that test is given twice a year. The
Yeah.
passing rate is very low. The year that I passed mine in 94, April of 94, I think the passing rate was less than 5%. So it's an extremely
Wow.
hard test, right? And people
Yeah.
have no idea. And it's crazy because it's an open book test. But then you consider that it's the entire tariff of the United States sitting in front of you. So it's 8.5 by 11. And when you add the customs regulations onto that, it's probably 3 feet wide. So think about a book that's, it's not a book. It's, it's like arm's length book.
Yeah.
And um,
How to even like go through the questions so fast?
it's hard. It's time test. I think there were 100 questions. I don't recall. A lot about passing that license is one. I've always been good at taking tests. I've always just been
Uh-huh.
able to do that.
Yeah.
But two, it's about learning where the answers are and being able to get
Mhm.
answers quickly and not so much about
Yeah.
memorizing. You just can't,
Memorize so much.
you just
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah.
And then along the way, those regulations change and they've changed more and more rapidly as we've moved forward. And the thing that was sort of
Yeah.
interesting about customs clearance when I started, that was a very it was very labor intensive. We didn't have a lot of automation.
Mhm.
If you had a computer you were working on, it was an AS400, green screen. There was a lot of manual
Mhm.
entry. Multiple invoices. Every invoice might have multiple line items on it. And I remember back in the day, there was a pharmacy, a national chain called Jack Eckerd or Eckerd Drugs here in the U.S.
Mhm.
And they would bring in 20, 30 containers at a time. Each container might have 20 invoices in it. And each invoice might have 30 or 40 line items. And it would take weeks it would just to do the data entry, right? And so
Mhm.
we were paid a lot for doing that. And then along the way, as technology kind of caught up to what we were doing, um,
Yeah.
it really commoditized it. And then you went from having your basic entry fee of say $100, $150, let's say, in
Mm.
1992 or 94 or whatever. As technology caught up, you started to seeing entries at $50 or $35, and it was really it was commoditized, and
Yeah.
large companies, large freight forwarding companies, were utilizing it just as competitive advantage. And there are a lot
Yeah.
of individual customs brokers that's all they did was customs brokerage, but these large international freight forwarders, customs brokerage was just a division, and they used it as a loss leader. They kind of gave it away to get the freight. They wanted the freight. They wanted the air freight. They wanted the ocean freight. They didn't, that's where they were making their
Yeah.
money. They weren't making the money. And so along the way, it really turned what was a competitive, strategic thing in doing customs clearance for your clients. It just turned it
Mhm.
into a commodity. And, we used to always laugh back in the day, um, because what we said in the industry is, people date their freight forwarders, but they marry their customs brokers. And
Yeah.
that really kind of changed in all of this because it was no longer, that deep relationship with your customs broker.
Yeah.
And then all that's changed, certainly over the last, I guess going back to 2016 when we had all the tariff changes under the first Trump administration. Certainly over these last few years with the tariffs, coming at us, really fast, 9/11, that
Yeah.
that caused a lot of cascading new
Yeah.
regulations, aimed at keeping Americans safe in shipping. Um, but we didn't really see early on to that change a resurgence of making money as a customs broker the way we do now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've always believed back in the day that, I wanted my clients as a customs house broker. I wanted my clients to look at me like they looked at their attorney, like they looked at their banker. I was a professional,
Mhm.
um, a lot of people looked at their freight forwarders. It's just a trucker, right? And I don't mean just a trucker. Trucks and truckers are so vitally important to our economy, but they
Mhm.
didn't really differentiate that, and needed to be. But what I
Yeah.
see really moving forward is I see that compliance piece, that customs clearance piece, that keeping, helping keep your clients within regulations, within compliance with the U.S. government and all the changes are coming at it. I see that as a growth
Yeah.
engine. And now we have stacked entry numbers, so you might have one item with three HTS numbers on it because of all the changes with the tariffs and everything like that. And so it just becomes, it has become, even with the technology, it's become maybe more complex than it was, 35 years ago.
Exactly. Yeah. And I have so many follow-up questions, but I'm gonna ask you the one that I really wanted to kind of, talk to you since I've seen your profile was the DHL's ocean freight bulk liquid practices.
Sure,
5 continents and technical
sure.
regulatory hurdles. How do we establish that? Like what started that? What's the legal framework that goes behind it? I'm pretty sure that's gonna be like a standard of performance that you've set. So tell
Sure.
us a little bit more on that.
Sure. So with that at DHL, that was with something called a Flexitank. And a Flexitank is this really cool bladder. It's anywhere from 16,000 to 24,000 liters, and it goes into a 20-foot container, 20-foot ocean container. And it turns that standard ocean container into a carrier of bulk liquids. Always non-hazardous. There's a lot of bulk wine moved around the world in these flexi tanks.
Mhm.
I had done my first flexi tanks probably in around 1994, 95 timeframe, something like that. Um, I did a project. I had no idea what the heck those things were, but somebody needed them, and I made some phone calls and I figured it out a little bit, and that was my first foray into it. Um, Eventually, after making my company just a windfall of money doing it, I had a catastrophic leak at the Port of Charleston, and it cost
Mhm.
about $30,000 to clean it up. And so the owner of my company said, "Well, don't do that anymore." And
Okay.
so I went away from it. And then years later, there were a few guys that actually worked for me. Our company was being sold. They didn't want to go with the new company, and they said, "Hey, we want to start a new freight forwarder." And I said, "You guys got to find a niche, right? You got to find a niche."
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so the one of them came back to me, and he said flexi tanks. I'm like, "What about flexi tanks?" And he said, "I think we can do a freight forwarder with flexi tanks." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And so I did that with them, sort of a silent partner early on, and then migrated into it. And then um, we eventually made that a thing. Unfortunately, had a bit of a falling out with my partners, but I knew that was a
Mhm.
big deal. And at that time, none of the really big freight forwarders were doing it. So I went to DHL, and DHL is the biggest. So I'm like, well, let me start at the top, and let me see if I can convince them to start this. And so
Mhm.
it took probably about 7, 8 months, I want to say, of negotiations back and forth with DHL, to get them to say, yeah, this is a great idea. Let's do that. And so I started that, would have been around May of 2012, and
Mhm.
um, I was based here in the U.S., but had this global reach to establish this. And then I just had to do it, and I spent. You can imagine with the DHL the number of compliance and
Yeah.
regulatory and legal, right? The legal, I cannot tell
Exactly.
you how many hours I spent on the phone legal in the U.S., legal for the Americas, then legal at from headquarters in Bonn. That you just had to do this, and then getting buy-in from all the different ocean freight heads around the world, the head of Europe, the head of Asia, head of the Americas
Mhm.
was on board with me from the very start. So the U.S. and the North and South America weren't hard. That was easy to do. But getting it established in these other places was a challenge. And you might think that the compliance part was the hardest part, but it really wasn't the hardest part. I expected that the compliance part would be hard from country to country to country, but it was
Mhm.
really more about having to adapt this to the local um, operating environment, right? So, something that you can do really easily in the port of Houston is maybe a little bit different if you're going to pull that out of, say, Vishakhapatnam in India, right?
Mhm.
It's a very different thing. And
Yeah.
I established, I had to establish import operations into the U.S. from Indonesia, from India. I spent time in Vishakhapatnam, and
Wow.
um, to do that. And unfortunately I had to be there in August and climb in and out of containers, and it
Yeah,
was
that's horrible.
125 degrees, and the humidity was off the charts. And I'm like, ooh, living in
Yeah.
Charleston, back in the day wasn't so bad. So,
Yeah.
um, so it wasn't really that government regulatory compliance that was the thing. It was really designing the global framework to make it work. So,
Mhm.
started in the U.S. Here's the framework for how we do things in the U.S. That was very easily replicated in Canada. Very similar operating environments. Then taking that to Europe, that also was fairly easy. Was able to
Mhm.
establish it quickly in the Netherlands, quickly in Germany, quickly in Italy, a little bit longer in France, but we were able to establish those things. And
Yeah.
then the India was it could have been harder, but I had the vice president of ocean freight for India uh, was great. And we had met here in the U.S. when he was in country, and he's like, there's a huge opportunity here and I want to do this. And so when I was in India for about 10 days, he traveled with me everywhere. I mean, he was right by my
Wow.
side the entire time. And so we really established India strong. Indonesia, because of the cultural differences, was really quite difficult.
Yeah.
um, China was a little difficult, but came around quickly when they figured it out. And so we went from nothing to moving, probably somewhere between 10 and 20,000 containers a year in probably about 5 years, 6 years, something like that.
Wow.
And then along the way, DHL ended up buying a company called Hillebrand, and Hillebrand, as opposed to our 10 or 20, they were doing, like 100,000 containers more a year. And so DHL bought Hillebrand, and Hillebrand had bought a company called Braid. And so Braid was number two, Hillebrand was number one, and then DHL
Mhm.
bought them both. And now DHL is certainly the 800-pound gorilla. I can't take credit for the
Yeah.
Hillebrand acquisition. That was done, without me. I wasn't involved in the acquisition.
Mhm.
But DHL saw something really interesting, both in the Hillebrand also did a lot of drinks
Mhm.
logistics outside of just the flexi tanks. They did, they moved whiskeys and things like that, which you can't do in a flexi tank because they're flammable and hazardous.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's actually a differentiator for DHL these days, for sure.
Wow, that's crazy. And to think that you would do all of that in a setting like this, but still, I was reading about how you think that all these complexity, the constant changes, it's all the people, the human standards that carry
Yeah.
the organization through. And especially today in the AI world, to hear somebody say that is amazing. So I want to hear a little bit more, how do you work through the KPIs to make sure that you can show people, or they show the management that human element is the bottom line here, versus the KPIs, versus the AI
Sure,
again.
sure. KPIs are something that you need. You have to measure what you're doing. I think sometimes you have companies that get too focused on the KPI.
Yeah.
Just like, in sales organizations, filling in Salesforce, that, you become a Salesforce manager, not a
Yeah.
salesperson. You're just, it's the
Mm-hmm.
same kind of thing. And what people don't realize about freight forwarding is it's ultimately a judgment business disguised as a process business. It's just process, um, is important in freight forwarding, but it's not the be all end all. At DHL, they did this really cool thing where they would sort of cross pollinate leadership between the different divisions. So you might have somebody from DHL supply chain, which is different from the global freight forwarding, or
Mm-hmm.
DHL Express, the small package. They would move those people into leadership positions within global freight. And I it was always interesting when that happened, because those people look at shipping and everything as process, and it is certainly. When you're looking at something like warehouse management, that supply chain gets into, it's process,
Yeah.
it's bark, it's SKUs, that's what that is. Express is the same thing. It's process driven. It's 95% process driven. But
Mm-hmm.
best freight forwarders are not process managers. They're creative problem solvers. It's just a different mindset. It's probably 40% process, maybe increasing because of the increased complexity of the software that we run on now. It can do so much more.
Mm-hmm.
We were doing,
Yeah.
spreadsheets and pencil and paper and trying to figure things out. Now that's done for you within a few clicks with the superior software. But
Yeah.
really, it's 40% process, and I always like to say 60% magic. you know um, Back in the day, in my career, when I was really, focused on on developing operations or developing growth, those kinds of things, there were
Mm-hmm.
times when I would maybe sell a piece of business at cost, and I
Yeah.
would bring it back to my operators and I would say, "Hey, here we go. We needed the volume.
Mm-hmm.
This is 1,000 ocean containers. It's sold at cost. It's a door-to-door move. See what you can do with it." And then
Mm-hmm.
they would come back to me maybe a week later and they would say, "Hey, look, we tweaked it and now we're going to make $400 or $500 a container." And you're like, "Okay, that's great. Now we've got something interesting, because $400 or $500 a container on 1,000 containers. That's an interesting number, right?"
Exactly.
But that's not process. That's knowing who to call. That's knowing which rocks to overturn, to look under, to figure it out, to get your vendors, those kinds of things, all
Mm-hmm.
pulling in the same direction. And the I think what you have to do, and what I think somewhat is disappearing a little bit in our industry, is rewarding those kind of high level operators, financially, and giving them a great work environment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's what I like to talk about, the human standard. You see a lot of this, where you have these top operators, and they're leaving companies because the environment that they're
Yeah.
working in is just brutal. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't technology was supposed to be this great thing that was going to make our lives easier. And in many ways in the world, it has made our lives easier. In the freight
Yeah.
forwarding world, it's made it in a lot of ways more difficult. I even to this day, I have a particular client that will call me at
Mm-hmm.
12:30 in the morning, 1 o'clock in the morning. He's in
Uh-huh.
Dubai, he's working, he needs
Uh-huh.
answers. And
Yeah.
WhatsApp starts blowing up on my bedside table, right? And
Yeah.
so you're sort of tethered 24/7. And I think that's also gotten to where the operators are, they're kind of, they're feeling the same thing. They're feeling the same thing, and it's like do more with less, because now you have the technology, rather than, hey, look, work your 40 hours a week and have a good work-life balance. And I still,
Mhm.
there are some companies that get that very right within my industry,
Mhm.
and man, there are just some companies that just get it very, very wrong. And compensating your best workers. And um so here's something I like to say. So I finished my MBA back in 2000. And I
Mhm.
remember people asking me, well, what'd you learn in your MBA? And I'm like, I can boil it down to a few sentences. And
Mhm.
this is what I learned, the core of my MBA. It seems so simple. To be successful, you hire the right people,
Mhm.
you put them in the right positions, you compensate them fairly.
Mhm.
Those people will be loyal. They will take care of your customers. Your customers
Yep.
will be loyal, and your customers will take care of the bottom line. And now your shareholder value, your stockholders, they're taken care of, right? And
Mhm.
it's really that simple. Now, yeah, there are a lot of complexities, and I can dive into statistical analysis and time value of money, equations to try and decide if a piece of business makes sense and is worthwhile. But that's
Mhm.
really the human standard, is treating the people, treating them well, paying them what they deserve, paying them a living wage, all of those things. Not the, there's still some, there's still some companies out there like, well, you should just be happy that you have a job. And
Yeah.
that's great until industry turns around. Right now, I see somewhat of a turnaround where probably for the last year or so, it's been that, hey, you should just be happy you have a job, to where now, companies are
Yeah.
starting to hire again. And so, you're paying this
Yeah.
person maybe below market. Well, they can just go down the street, make a lot more, and work less. And so I see that change happening. But then you have companies like, for instance, there's a US company called Expeditors, and they pay their people very, very well. The
Mhm.
employees get to share in the profit of the branch, and branch managers make a lot of money. The desk operators make a lot of money, and it's just a great place from that perspective.
Wow. So when you're looking at, the future, I guess, of the global trade as a whole, when we're looking at the, risk of talents, because obviously human knowledge cannot be replaced with AI, right? Because we come
Right.
up with new things, AI is still stuck with the old stuff. So obviously, like,
Right.
that plus the scalability aspect of it or complexity aspect of it, where do you see, the shift happening in 2026 and in the future when you're looking at global trade as a whole?
Certainly AI is important. AI is here to
Yeah,
stay.
yeah.
I still, in the back of my head, as a firm Gen Xer, I still worry about Skynet becoming aware, and having Terminators running around a little bit. Um,
Yeah.
but I really think, I really think that technology scales information, but then you have experienced people that scale judgment, and I think that's the difference, right? Yeah, AI is great. It can help you track and trace your cargo.
Mhm.
You can use AI to access ocean buoys to see when the ships are coming in, cameras in the different ports. You can actually, and many times, well, I know there are track and trace technology providers out there that have better grasp of where cargo ships are than the ship owners. So steamship
Mhm.
lines, their own track and trace isn't as good as the outside provider, because that outside provider is using um, AI and accessing what's available in this environment. There's cameras everywhere now, so you just have to access the cameras.
Yeah, yeah.
But right now in freight forwarding, judgment is still probably one of the most expensive assets to replace. And I
Mhm.
think that within freight forwarding, we're going to come back to that. AI is a great tool, for freight
Yeah.
forwarding. But AI, there's AI isn't going to replace the operator who knows, oh gosh, we had booked 20 loads with this trucker in this port, and all of a sudden that trucker, they have a problem and they can only cover 10 of those, and we need to
Yeah.
get loads loaded tomorrow, and it's
Hmm.
it's 4:30, and it's that kind of thing. um,
Exactly.
when that knowledge, that experience, becomes so hard to replace, because what's AI going to do? AI doesn't know
Hmm.
that. Oh, maybe if you go to there's trucking load boards out there where you can potentially go out and grab, um, loads. But if you do that, you might not know, if you've called that particular drayage company. Hey, look,
Hmm.
you need us to cover 10. We can only cover 6 because 4 of our power units are down and in the shop, right? Okay, so I
Yeah.
got those
Yeah.
6 covered. Now I got to, those kinds of things. I think that's really where AI, is going to fall short, at least for the foreseeable future, as far as I'm
Hmm.
concerned. I think AI is
Yeah.
great. Um, I think AI, can be a great tool. If you're creating presentations, it's
Hmm.
not a bad idea to take that and then run it through Perplexity or Grok or whatever, and say, hey, look at this. Does this have a logical flow? And did I miss any points that might be important? And
Hmm.
then they come back, and the thing that's funny about that is probably 30 or 40% of the time they'll add something to it that is just completely erroneous.
But yeah,
Because
it's
AI,
not
they
right.
don't they
Yeah.
don't know. AI just doesn't know yet. Certainly
Yeah.
in my industry,
Exactly.
it's just not there. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
No,
So
I
I
understand where you're coming from. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
That's amazing. Well, Jeff, I have so many more questions, but I know we're running out of time today. So we'll probably have to have a part two on this. And
Oh,
I just
I'm
want to
always
say,
available.
I just want to say this has been such a great podcast to learn so much about ocean freight that I've never known, especially when you're talking about, establishing standards for your operation, when you're building systems. It sounds so amazing. So, my last question, I cannot let you go before I ask you this is, what is your advice? What is your piece of advice to young people, younger professionals who are looking to kind of, see ocean freight, but also grow in this area? What would your advice to them be?
Yeah, that's great. It has been one of my great pleasures in my career, is to hire young people and then guide them, and then eventually you got to set them free to go out and do great things in the world.
Hmm.
That's, to this day, I still love to do that. My advice is a couple of things. When I graduated, I couldn't find a good mentor, and I found I had a couple of really great bosses over the years. I don't know that I ever had a great mentor. And I've worked for
Hmm.
some really, really strong people, and I can name names, but they know who they are, and I've talked to them, and I thank them profusely, but I just didn't have a mentor. So it's,
Yeah.
search out a mentor, find a mentor. Um, and the other thing I'm going to tell you is not really industry specific. It's just broadly. You want that industry mentor, but here's the thing. You have got to establish discipline in your life.
Hmm.
Um, I went to a military college that instilled a level of discipline in me that,
Yeah.
is sort of hard to replicate, but you have to fight for that discipline. I also had, a United States Marine as a father, so there
Yeah.
was
There
certainly,
you go.
he wasn't
Yeah.
he wasn't a harsh father. In fact, he was one of the greatest dads ever to walk the face of the earth. Um, but he did instill things like, hey, if you're on time, you're late. If you're early, you're on
Yeah.
time.
You're like 10
You
minutes
know,
early.
and yes, and but outside of that, if you don't have, if you didn't grow up with a Marine Corps dad, if you didn't go to a military school, what can you do to find discipline? And I do this myself. And I think we've talked about this. I've trained in martial arts for most of my life, and I still do that.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I will be leaving my 50s decade here shortly, but I'm a black belt in Krav
Wow.
Maga. I hold belts in other disciplines. I've done jujitsu and kickboxing and karate, and I've
Wow.
trained under some of the sort of the royalty of martial arts in the United States. Joe Corley, from a martial arts perspective, he's a big name in martial arts. He's been a
Yeah.
mentor, like a big brother to me, here in the Atlanta area. But there's a discipline when I first started training with Joe. Um, I had a green belt in Taekwondo. I'd never gotten past a green belt. I trained in multiple disciplines and had belts in multiple disciplines. I never had a black belt.
Mhm.
And I think I was
Yeah.
48 when I started training with Joe. And I said, hey, look, I want to be a black belt in Krav Maga, which Krav Maga is
Yeah.
the fighting system that Israeli Defense Forces use. So
Yeah.
it's real world application, right? And I said, I
Mhm.
want to be a black belt by the time I'm 50. And he looked at me and he said, well, it's possible. It's not probable. Um,
Uh-huh.
and I think that I didn't get it by 50, but I had just turned 51 when I got it.
Wow.
But again, it was discipline. When I was home,
Yeah.
I was, I would take, gosh, I would do 12 classes a week, each an hour and a half long.
That's
When I had
crazy.
free time at the house, I was working on my techniques. Had the heavy bag, had the speed bag, had all the things. I'm not saying you have to get into a martial arts discipline. I think it's one of the better things to get into because it just helps
Mhm.
in all aspects of your life with your confidence. But do something.
Yeah.
If you're a runner, run. Be disciplined and run. If you're a cyclist,
Yeah.
cycle. Be disciplined. Ride your bike. If
Mhm.
you're a gym rat, I'm also a bona fide gym rat, and if I don't get at least four, preferably five, good sessions lifting weights in the gym each week, I'm a little grumpy. I'm a little hard to I'm a little hard to be around because I
Yeah.
don't, I know my body needs that. And it's that discipline
Mhm.
will spill over into your work life. And I think that's something that um I think some of our younger generations don't they just haven't had that same access to discipline. So you've got to go and find the discipline. I needed the discipline. Even with the Marine Corps father, I chose to go to the Citadel because I knew
Yeah.
that if I went to, maybe back home to Ohio State, or living in South Carolina to going to the University of South Carolina, chances of my finishing school were probably not great. Certainly not in 4 years, because I was just the guy
Yeah.
that, I was going to, I'm not going to study. I'm going to go get a beer. Right. It's just, I needed the discipline of the Citadel, and I chose that. So choose discipline. And you can choose discipline or not choose discipline. But if you choose discipline, everything else becomes easier.
Easier. Yeah. I agree to that. Definitely. But yeah, I Jeff, that has been such a master class. Thank you so much for your time today here.
Thank you.
I
I've
hope
enjoyed it.
you enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Because
It's a lot of
I've
fun.
enjoyed it immensely. I've
Great.
enjoyed it immensely. And
Great.
I hope we can do a round two with you as well and learn a bit more about global trade. But thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure having you on today.
Thank you so much.